Hi, everyone. Welcome to Conversations, Challenges to Inuit Art Sovereignty. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Alyson Hardwick. I'm originally from Nunatsiavut and currently live in Toronto, Ontario, where I work at the Inuit Art Foundation. Although we're all joining remotely across North America today, I would like to acknowledge the land I currently reside on. I'm on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, the original owners and custodians of this land. Today, this place is home to many, including a diverse urban Indigenous community of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis. Thank you so much for joining us today. Conversations is a series of 6 live webinars across 2021, bringing together Canadian and Alaska Inuit for moderated discussions with audience participation, providing information and insights on subjects important to Indigenous communities. This series is a partnership between Inuit Art Foundation and the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center. Today's conversation will be recorded and posted at the website provided in the Q&A window. If you'd like to watch past conversations, they're also posted on the same website. Our conversation today focuses on challenges to Inuit sovereignty in the art world, art at museums, and beyond. The moderator is Tanya Lukin Linklater. She is an artist and doctoral candidate of cultural studies at the Queen's University. Tanya is also an artist mentor of the MFA program in Studio Arts at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Taqralik Partridge is a writer, throat singer, and curator. She is the first director of the new Cultural Center Nordic Lab, which opened in 2021 at the SAW Center in Ottawa, an artist-run center focusing on performance and media arts. Sven Haakanson is an associate professor of anthropology and curator of Native American collections at the Burke Museum at the University of Washington. He is also an accomplished carver and photographer. To learn more information about each speaker, including website links, please visit the event website. Thank you so much for coming, Nakamik, and I'm going to pass it off to Tanya to start off.
Chumai, hello everyone. It's nice to see you all. I thought today I would just take a few moments to share a little bit about how I've come to know Sven and Taqralik over time as a way to begin our visit this afternoon where I am. I'm speaking in Nibising Anishinaabeg territory, which is about maybe 4 hours north of Toronto. And I'm really honored to be with my colleagues here today and looking forward to our conversation. I've known of Sven since I was a youth, and he was undertaking his graduate studies. And in this way, like Shukbiak folks such as Alicia Drebeck and April Actonin Counselor and others, he's made space for Shukbiak or Ulujuk peoples who are embarking on educational journeys and research with and for our communities. His subsequent work at the Ulujuk Museum in relation to communities, visits to collections, Ulujuk belongings returning home to Kodiak Island for visits, repatriation and outreach with youth has been significant. I believe his work is as much about healthy, strong communities from his positions within museums in relation to ancestral and cultural belongings, as it's a part of this collective work that we're undertaking, which has been significant also in the formation of my artistic practice, research, and writing. And I've known of the work of Taqralik Partridge since 2007. I first encountered her writing, which was incredibly moving to me, and her performances. And later, I witnessed her visual art installations at Art Gallery of York University, and last month visited the exhibition Ulujuk, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Taqralik. Many things appear that she curated at SAW Gallery in Ottawa through her position there. This included work by Sonya Kelliher-Combs, Maureen Grubin, and Cecil Berg, and I was very moved by this exhibition, as I'm moved by her artistic practices, which are in relation to Inuit peoples, lands, and ideas. So in my view, both Sven and Taqralik are practitioners as artists, writers, curators, and community members, and who are deeply committed to this work. But I wanted to begin today by asking what Inuit art sovereignty means to each of you. And I was just going to ask Sven to begin.
Tanya, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for asking me to speak and be able to share the work that not only I'm doing, but also the responsibility that we have in our positions and where we're situated. When I saw the question about what does Inuit art sovereignty mean to me, and my first response was, at what level? What levels do we want to look at this? For me, it means knowledge and ability to make decisions for the betterment of our community's future through cultural understanding of our lands, waters, and places. And it's also the control and ways to perpetuate and sustain our cultural practices. So just from the cultural perspective, the idea of sovereignty is having control over this knowledge and taking control so that our communities are speaking for it and it's not being spoken for by others. And so that puts a lot of responsibility on us as Indigenous peoples to look at not only the histories, but what has been said, and then start to listen to what the communities are saying and how they're saying it, and then reflecting that back to the greater public. So that's what it means for me, and that kind of responsibility.
Taqralik?
Thanks, Tanya. So nice to be with you. As Tanya mentioned, my name is Taqralik Partridge. I'm originally from Nunavik. Qunmiġu is my home community in Nunavik, which is in northern Quebec. I'm currently based in Ottawa, but right now I'm joining you from Guelph on Anishinaabe territory, Mississaugas of the Credit territory. So happy to be with you. What does Inuit art sovereignty mean to me? I think I agree with what Sven was saying about being able to define ourselves, being able to have control over how Inuit art is portrayed and disseminated, and but also having the resources to ensure that we can continue to make culture, continue to make this heritage, to have it both for posterity, but also for current use. Having resources behind teaching youth, supporting youth to go into the arts as a viable option. Having resources to support practices that are not necessarily aimed at making sales, but creation in all the ways that Inuit use creation in daily life. Like, I think the way I see it is that Inuit, we have the reason that there are so many Inuit artists is because it's part of our culture to have a creative practice, even if we don't call it that. Like, it's part of our culture for everybody to have some sort of creative work that they do, whether it's, you know, what we call art, or sewing, or building things, or any of that. It's like, it's considered to be very healthy, and I think it is very healthy. So like resources to support those kinds of activities that are kind of seen as, that could be framed as art making, but not necessarily towards selling in the market, but towards contributing to our communities. And I think that can also be true for Inuit communities where the community members are not necessarily in the communities in the north as well.
Other speakers during this series of conversations have identified the work of sovereignty similarly as agency, autonomy, and self-determination over cultural expression that includes both tangible and intangible culture. And I think about intangible culture as this sort of relationship between the people, the land, the water, the universe, our non-human or more than human relatives. And the ways in which this is transmitted or shared, which has to do with orality, our oral histories and our laws. And key people in the field have described this agency and autonomy as having been interrupted by the violence of colonialism felt by our ancestors and our relatives. And so this is partly what I think about when I consider this significant work, the felt, the embodied, our lived experience, addressing history, but also, as both of you have spoken to, the future generations. While we're returning to ancestral knowledges, which give us great strength. So I wanted to move to another question, which is that as we were preparing for this conversation, we discussed key participants in Inuit art, including the artists and communities generating work and being in relation to intangible and tangible culture, institutions, both public museums and tribal museums, and private collections. And I'm just going to ask each of you to speak to your work in relation to institutions, private collections, artists, and/or communities, and how this work supports Inuit art sovereignty. And I'm going to ask you to share first, Sven.
Boy. So, I mean, where can I start with that question in terms of how I have the privilege to do the work I do, both originally through the Ulujuk Museum and now through the Purruq Museum, and really thinking about what is my role in this? Yes, I would love to be producing more artwork, but my role is now to support artisans, support communities, getting access to this knowledge that we care for. And thinking about, okay, how do we start to change the narrative within museums and institutions that care for and have our collections? So trying to think about what I can do in my position and how I can move forward with the kind of research and work that is important for our communities. And so that means for me, stepping back and listening, okay, what have I learned over the last 20 years, working with my community in Kodiak, and working with communities so that I better understand what's happening. And then also, how do I support them so that I can start to lift up not only the artisans, but the storytellers, our community members, so that they're sharing their voice and it's not passed over. And that takes time. When I started working in the Ulujuk Museum, we created the Living Cultures traveling exhibit, where we took collections from the museum in Kodiak out to our rural villages. We took this knowledge that we have now are caring for and put it back into a living context. How do we bring artisans along with us to share that knowledge, but then to show how that knowledge is really thriving? And when I was looking at and writing down some of the things, I wrote down this: wisdom is within our cultural heritages. It's passed on by stories, the creation, the use and passing on of this knowledge in a hands-on context. So as artisans, as Taqralik was talking about, with our art being part of who we are, that's how we share our stories. But that's how we're passing on our cultural heritages and our cultural knowledges, so that these are all living heritages that are sustained and will continue to sustain our communities across the Arctic and within all Indigenous communities. And then for me, every cultural piece has knowledges to sustain our ways of life and being. I mean, but it's up to us as individuals to help bring this knowledge to light, and how we use museum collections and our practices to do that. So to answer that question, I think would be where I'm at right now. I see that Tanya has dropped off for a second, but Taqralik, can you please?
All right. Her question was about how do we support Inuit art sovereignty in our work, right?
Yeah.
Where I see myself as playing a small part in a big group of Indigenous artists and curators and community members that are working to support other Indigenous artists, and in my case specifically Inuit artists from the North. I don't think that I have like big brush strokes, but little brush strokes. But it's really about insisting on being in places where the Inuit have a place in whatever, in the gallery, in a show, at a talk, like insisting on being in those spaces and making sure that other people are able to enter those spaces as well. I think that a lot of people have this same kind of attitude, a lot of other Inuit curators and artists. And really in like small day-to-day ways, I try to think of, okay, how can I support the Inuit artists here? How can I take whatever the situation is and make it just a little bit better? So for example, when I'm working with Inuit translations, I always want to make sure that translators are paid well, because that's valuing the Inuktitut language, but also recognizing that they're also creating, they're part of the creation process. Like they're not just translating like it's like a one-to-one and it's just done. So I always want to insist that translators are paid for every instance where their work is used in a new situation. I want to access Inuit businesses for different things. If I have, like, for example, service providers, when we had an exhibition open, we had opening last couple of weeks ago, we had Inuit businesses providing food and beverages for the opening, and also an Indigenous Anishinaabe chef who was presenting their food, things like that, like always bringing as many people in as possible. And then always, like, I've had this kind of conversation with other Inuit, not necessarily even in the arts field, but in any kind of Inuit organization. There's a term that sometimes people use called being pro-Inuk. And it's not like being against anybody, but it's being for Inuit. So like always trying to let Inuit have a seat at the table, especially when it has to do with things that have to do with us. So I think I feel like that's my attitude in everything that I do, even not necessarily the arts, but for me, again, the idea of creativity and the idea of the arts, it's for everybody, for all Inuit, and it's part of our culture, our living culture. So I guess another thing that I really want to see is more access to the arts for all Inuit.
I completely agree with you, Taqralik. That's some of the things we've been doing here through the Burke Museum is paying our artists when they come in, to share, and not just that, hey, we are going to give you a space to come in to do this, but inviting them in, but making sure that we're giving them a space and acknowledging it. And that's some of the wonderful things that we were able to do with the new Burke is we put our Indigenous voices first in the collections and at what was shared. Instead of myself as a curator interpreting the cultural pieces, the communities are interpreting them. And so how do we carry those practices that you're talking about even further into all our institutions? So yeah, to me, that's music to my ears.
Something else that I have thought of for a long time and that I'm really happy to see people talking about is the idea that Inuit, because we're so close in our families and because of the way that family members are interdependent across generations, it's really sometimes not useful for individual artists to have opportunities that don't include any provisions for support for their family members, whether it be if they have to travel with a child or an elder, or if somebody, even if they speak English, they need to have an interpreter with them or somebody to accompany them because they can't navigate cities, for example. Like recognition of those relations and how they're so important to the work, even if the person shows up and it doesn't seem like they're the one holding the paintbrush or the sculpting tool, like how community contributes to these and how we have to support those community connections as much as we can and require of funding agencies, for example, to also support those things. And like I said, I'm really happy to see that a lot of places that I've worked with have started really to take on to that and to recognize that that is important.
I apologize. There's now a wind warning where I am, and I was disconnected, but I did hear at least part of what you shared, Taqralik, and I'm really grateful for those comments. And Sven, I'm not sure if you had sort of also replied to that because I was off for a little while. You did. Okay. All right. I'd like to maybe share a little bit. I'd like to ask Sven if you can share a little bit more about this kind of work between museums and community that you've undertaken. And I know you might have some slides because I'm interested in some questions about the responsibility of institutions, and given your experience, how you might recommend the formalization of some of these processes that you're undertaking. So I'm gonna ask you to take that question up.
Thank you. When I was asked to come and share in this, I was very excited because last year we received a large Inuit donation from the Kinsleys, Charles and Gretchen Kinsley, and they donated over 150 cultural pieces that they collected over a period of, I would say, 40 years from across Canadian Arctic. And we have that here. And my first question to them was, wonderful, but what do we know about the cultural pieces? What do we know about the artisans and the communities from where they came? And they had a lot of information, but I was more interested in wanting to find ways to reconnect the art back to the communities, because a lot of times the artist would make it, sell it, and then it would disappear from the family or the community forever. And so how do we reverse that? And so one of the things I asked when they made that donation is, can you provide support so I can hire students to research and start to help the museum, help us reconnect this knowledge with communities, and then also start to change the way we accept collections and how we engage with them. And so I've been working with Larissa Ozarensky, who's a graduate student who helped us collect artist files on a majority of the cultural pieces so far. And now another undergraduate student, Olivia Anderson, who's helping us with connecting to the communities. And in fact, just yesterday, she was able to help us connect with Isabella Avingak, Coquette. And so, starting that process right from the get-go of these collections when you get them, and changing the way we're doing this work. And so I'm going to do a quick PowerPoint or share some slides just to show you where we're at. The Inuit art that we received is absolutely stunning, beautiful work. And when I was going through that, I was interested in, okay, how do we research and learn about these pieces? How do we reconnect them? And then how do we share that knowledge? But share the knowledge so that it's protected for and by the community as well. I mean, we're now getting into an age where we're looking at 3D printing and all this other stuff that if we don't help these communities protect this knowledge and protect what they're doing, we're going to be taking away from those artisans for making not only an income, but making money to pay for where they live, allowing them to be sustainable. So how do we do that? And then who are the artists? How do we care for these living pieces? And then where do we get support to help the communities do this work? Because it sort of falls outside of normal, okay, we want to go out and do an exhibit, so we need to get this money for this. Well, actually, we want to do something that is way before we even get to an exhibit. How do we get this knowledge and share it back? And then how do we support it? And for example, I mean, understanding these cultural pieces is like looking at the muskox in the wind, and who is the artisan? And what else can we learn about this individual and where he's from? But also, how can we share that back to the community? And really going and diving deep into each of these cultural pieces as we are learning about them, but then also making sure that that knowledge is going back to those communities. And And here is, how do we share it? Once we reconnect these connections, how do we share these pieces? And how do we do it in a way that's beneficial to the communities and not just the normal extractive practices of outside institutions or individuals? And that's something that's really important for me, is how do we reverse that extractive practice? And then how do we take a role in caring for and then understanding and honoring communities and artists and cultural knowledge that's embodied within each cultural piece? And for me, this is just the start of learning about not only what we're caring for, but also how we're building these relationships with communities and artists. Reversing it, creating long-term relationships that aren't based on individuals, but on institutions and their responsibility to sustainable relationships. And that is giving access to community members and artists from where the collections originated. And so again, it's asking these questions and starting the conversations. I don't have all the answers. I'm only just starting this. We are only just starting this. So that we can build relationships of bringing this knowledge back so that the next generation of artists can be inspired by what was done before, but take it to another level. So continually regenerating new knowledges, but also new artisans, and supporting them with how brilliant the previous artisans were. And that's by reconnecting the collections. And so these are some of the things that I'm trying to do. And where I feel my responsibility as a curator in this position at the Purruq Museum can do. And also as an Indigenous person, thinking about what would I have loved to have known when I was growing up in my community. Stop there, Tanya. Thank you.
I just want to say, there's a long history of Qunmiġu or Ulujuk people visiting collections, and also not only, of course, our community members, but many other folks. And what I remember from reading about what occurred when community went, including some of my relatives, as well as myself in some of the visits that I've undertaken over time, is this deep sort of emotional response when people are reconnected with these works, these belongings, ancestral and cultural belongings that are made by our ancestors, but also by some of our relatives in more recent memory. And that process is complex and nuanced and requires definitely support from and labor by curators and collections managers and key people within those institutions. And more recently, those folks have started to be Indigenous, or in some cases, it depends on the institution and where that's been able to happen. So there is this long history of this work where we know many people have gone to visit. But I also wonder, and I think this is an important continued practice. It's certainly been important for my own thinking and being in relation to my ancestors and my histories. But I also want to pose to Taqralik, one of in our conversation in preparation for today, I think you were sort of posing this idea about how, which you've also spoken to, Sven, but how Inuit artists can make a living as artists without feeling that our cultural heritage is only a commodity. And in this way, you're sort of folding into the question or into this idea, the Inuit belief that these belongings and collections and otherwise have life or energy. And I'm just asking you to say a bit more about that. And I have a follow-up question for you.
I mean, from my understanding, traditional Inuit belief is that every single thing in our world has life force. Objects, stones, of course, creatures, humans. But it makes us have to respect objects and respect things and treat them in a way that is respectful. So, for example, the Inuit value of not taking more than you need, And of course, people talk about this in relation to hunting and gathering, but of traditional food and materials. But I think it also extends to contemporary life. But also the idea that there is life force in everything, of course, would extend to these objects that are made. And I feel like it's like an even more pronounced kind of like force, if you want to put it that way, in objects that have been made. You know, Inuit sculptors are often quoted as saying that they are just revealing what is in the stone. Like they're listening to the stone and what it wants to be. And then when they're making their work, then if they listen well, then they make it the way that the stone wanted to be. And I feel in my own practice when I'm making things that I try to emulate that kind of attitude of, well, what does this thing want to be? And then, you know, when you do it well, it's almost like you can't believe that you've done it because it's not actually you, it's the life force of the thing. And so when we're looking at especially older sculptures, older works by Inuit, you know, like you said, ancestors, or else even more recent ancestors, more recent family members that have either passed on or, you know, done work a long time ago. I think like we have a connection to those things that is beyond just like, oh, isn't that nice? Or wasn't my grandfather talented? Or, oh, look, that sold for $50,000. Like it's not, that's not the value. The value is the connection that we have to those things. What was the second part of the question?
So the second part has to do with sort of your thinking in relation to private collections. So this is a sort of a secondary component to that, because there are collections, of course, in tribal museums or in community museums or in public institutions or public museums, but there's also private collections.
Right. I think like, you know, whenever, for lots of reasons, but one is the reason that I said before, which is that our cultures, Inuit culture really has an emphasis on creative activity, creative work by, you know, that's why we have so many artists. For that reason, whenever people are making things even to sell, they're creating culture, you know, and like our culture is so important to protect and to give access to, you know, young people and future generations and whoever is around today, young, old, whoever. And like, of course, people have to make a living and they have to sell things, and like sometimes have to sell things under circumstances where they just need some money right now. Like I've had to do that. But I think if we're talking about Canada being in an atmosphere of reconciliation, and Canadians, so-called Canadians or you know, whoever, Americans too, wanting to recognize the rights and the needs and the historical injustices of Indigenous, historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous people have and do experience, then there's a responsibility on all different levels for people to work towards that reconciliation. And one of those things is I think, a small thing that private collectors can do is really be part of this movement to give access to, especially older works, to Inuit community members. And there's different ways that people can do that. And it's like, not just like, oh, this is the way and you do it, but it's to always be thinking of that. So for example, I've met so many collectors who are like, oh yeah, I have this amazing collection. It's going to go to this Inuit collection specifically from Qunmiġu, from this one part of Nunavut, right? And you know, when I pass on, this collection is going to go to this such and such center in the Midwest of the US. And it's like, okay, but why don't you think about your legacy? Could be that you are returning this collection to something that is closer to the Inuit of Qunmiġu, for example. closer to Baker Lake people, closer to Rankin, and closer to up there, something like that. There's not a capacity right now, although there should be a capacity to have, a very high-end museum quality, whatever in whatever part of Inuit. But okay, then if you're leaving an endowment with that, why don't you leave it towards something that could be for Inuit? Why don't you, like, if people are collecting because they're thinking about their legacy, then why think about your legacy only as going to such and such university of the town that you're from? What about the legacy that you can leave towards reconciliation, the legacy towards the living culture of Inuit people? For this reason, I personally, even though I'm not a prolific artist, but for visual works that I make, if they're one-of-a-kind pieces, I intend never to sell to private collectors. I want only to sell to institutions. And I was talking to Lachlan Williams and Bathory about this, about how it's a little bit funny because, like, we have this ambiguous relationship historically with these institutions because they hold so many of our objects. But now these are the places where people can go and see things. And I'm thinking in the future, not that I think my work is so amazing and spectacular, but I am a witness to my contemporary, the life here now. And if by chance somebody in the future wants to see how I witnessed this, I want them to be able to go and see it. And I don't want it to be in somebody's collection or going, if it suddenly gained value, I don't want it going around the auction circuit, making money that the Inuit don't see.
Sven, did you want to respond? Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
So I agree. And that's one of the questions I asked the Kinsleys about having it go back closer to the community. And it becomes a legal issue and taxes. And so something that you can challenge Canadian is how can donors make a tax donation to another country? So that might help with that kind of process, because that's one of the things I was curious about is, great, we'd love to care for the collections, but what about having access to the communities from where they came? And it boils down to, basically it boils down to taxes, finances. And so this is when I then turned to say, hey, can you support us doing research and trying to find ways we can reconnect the knowledge in these cultural pieces of communities? So even with private donors who are giving to these other institutions, getting them to think about, okay, well, if you can't give it back because of the laws, is there a way you can create an endowment to allow Inuit artists to be able to be paid to come down to research the collections, to then take that knowledge back home and create their own pieces based on those inspired pieces. Something that I've been doing with our Ulujuk community, of traveling to Europe to learn from the culture pieces, because we can't get those culture pieces back right now, but we can get the knowledge back. And so thinking creatively about, okay, if we can't get them here, how about we find ways to support our artisans to come down to see the collections so they have access to this knowledge and to be able to share those kinds of ongoing relationships, but create it so that it's sustainable and not just a one-time thing. So, when you are talking with those kinds of private collectors and thinking about, okay, well, if they do want to buy your cultural pieces, saying, is there a way that you will, in your will, promise to give it to a cultural institution that will allow my community members to have access to this, so that you're not restricting yourself just to museums? And I'm not promoting private collectors, but that is one way as an artisan that you will be able to raise the value of your art and awareness of your art within museums as well. So, thinking about how you would engage the art collectors, and then also challenging them to find ways to support artisans that they haven't really thought about into the future.
I've been thinking a great deal about how there's information that's left from my ancestors, left from my relatives within these material objects. And that part of my work is to discern and decipher what that information is. And that the way that I look at that work will be quite different from the way Sven does or from someone else from our community. And that each of us has, strengths and gifts and ways in which we see, but that within these material objects is that information about the way in which our ancestors saw the world at the time and the moment that they were in, just as you've spoken to this, Taqralik, from this contemporary moment. And so one of the things that you spoke earlier about was allowing for different people to join, family members, children, youth, elders, translators, navigators, to be a part of the process. I think that's really significant. I think there's also a significant part of institutions and funders not deciding, who's appropriate to see collections and who isn't, that we have to decide that's a part of that work, and what our research might look like could look very different depending on who we are. I have brought my daughters to a collection recently to look at work. And it was incredible what they saw in those moments that I didn't see. And I think that's really powerful and really beautiful. And I really wonder about the ways in which they're going to take this up in their own lifetimes, and the many different ways in which it could come to be in their lives. So I guess that would be one other piece that I might offer to this conversation is, when we're speaking about research, sometimes there can be barriers for that research. And of course, I think, Sven, you're doing that really important work to remove those barriers and to connect those communities and to connect. But I know that sometimes when we enter these spaces, it can be difficult for many different reasons. And I just offer that because I think if we're speaking about challenges to Inuit art sovereignty, access to collections, of course, is an important piece. The return so that they're closer to home, as you've proposed, Taqralik, and understanding the life force within them and how they hold within them important information for our peoples that is different from the way in which they might interact with the public, or more general public. I've also been thinking about the many lives of these materials, of these tangible cultural works, and these moments of reconnection that we've each spoken to, which are incredibly powerful. And these belongings existed within a world and were activated by the people. And so I know that we've talked a little bit about how we can activate them now, but we might have spoken about it in sort of broad terms. So I'm wondering if you can think a little bit about specific examples around this sort of activation of these belongings now. Is it through return? Is it within a museum context if they can't be returned? What are the limitations of this, but also what are the potentials of this? And so I guess we've talked broadly about this connection and the knowledge, but I wonder if you can provide a few, one or two examples from your experience. And I offer it to either of you, whoever would like to take that question up first.
Taqralik, you want to go?
No, you go ahead. I think I spoke last.
Okay. Well, I feel lucky. I've been able to do this for the last 20 plus years, really thinking outside the box of how do we provide access to our communities, but also how do we share that cultural knowledge that's embodied within every cultural piece. Even if it's a static stick, there is cultural knowledge that's embodied within it, but a lot of times we don't know what it is. When you're bringing communities, and I've had the privilege to take artisans to both France, Russia, and Finland, and bring the artisans there, and to be able to watch and learn not only just from the collections, but learn from them about what they were seeing is really powerful. So thinking about how you engage collections that we don't have access to, and then allowing the community members to be able to go to these places, to be able to learn and then bring that knowledge back to share. And one of the things that I was doing with the Ulujuk Museum is we would take these artisans to these collections, but we would ask them to create a piece for the museum based on that experience, and then also go out to a community of their choice to share what they learned. So it's not just a free trip to someplace, but it's a trip where they're learning about knowledge from our ancestors, bringing that knowledge back to the communities and sharing it within the next generation based on their own lived experience. So it's not just, oh, you know, I went there and I'm going to share it. It's all of us, we all went there, and each one of us has brought back different knowledges, different ways of sharing. And so being creative and being open to all of these different minds and different ways of doing this kind of work. So really actively engaging with communities by doing that kind of work has been, to me, really transforming for not only our community, but also for the museums that we work with, because then they see multiple minds and ways of looking at cultural pieces, and they're hearing multiple voices, not just one person saying it, but a community saying this, and how valuable it is. And that raises an awareness of not only to the caretakers, but to our communities of what is out there and what we have yet to learn, and also what we have a responsibility to figure out a way to go to these places to continue these kinds of long-term relationships, so that they're not just individual, but they're institutional and community-wide, and community, well, the length of the community. So really kind of putting it out there where this is really important. And this comes back to Taqralik of talking about, why is it in the Midwest, collections in the Midwest, why aren't they back home? Well, all right, okay, so if we can't do that, how do we say to these museums and donors, provide us with the funding so we can bring community members here to not only learn from the collection, celebrate them, but bring that knowledge back to create the next generation of storytellers, artisans, and all of this other lived experience that comes with these kinds of cultural exchanges. Yes, I would love some of the cultural pieces to go back, but again, that will happen in time. And museums can get creative about doing long-term loans and cultural exchanges. We did a long-term loan with the kayak museum from the Peabody Museum at Harvard that's now at the Ulujuk Museum for a single man's warrior kayak. And that started with working with an elder and then having him share his knowledge, and then building on that, and then having the institution take that on, and then building on with the Ulujuk Museum. But now it's accessible to all the community. So again, it's not thinking that, oh, we have to keep it here, keep it here. Let's think about, how do we open it up so that these cultural pieces are seen as living, not these stagnant pieces. And to me, every cultural piece is living and has cultural knowledge that will allow us to create sustainable ways for artisans, create sustainable ways for storytelling. So it opens up a whole nother level of work for us, not only as museums, but for our communities.
Yeah, I feel in this conversation that it's sort of multidirectional. We're thinking about the museum, but we're not centering it. We're thinking about community, we're thinking about artists, and we are thinking about private collectors and their legacy. So it's this, it's more of these series of relationships without necessarily only centering the museum, which I appreciate in this conversation. It's like, how do we continue to be in relation? How do we continue to learn from what has been kept and shared, or it is now being shared through these processes? Taqralik, did you want to address that question?
the first question or just the one that you just said now? What was the first question again? The first
Either
question
one.
at the beginning was, like I said before, like I feel like I'm really a small player in a big sea, but I try to do small things to have people have access to, we're talking about cultural heritage, like, or, I mean, there's all kinds of words we can use in English. I think, in like colonial Western culture, it's like everything is so binary. Everything has to be this or that. You're academic or you're not. You're this or you're that. You're a museum or you're not a museum. Like, it's not like, for me, it's like all these things that have to do with Inuit cultural heritage. They should all be accessed by Inuit, period. But like small things that I try to do is like, I'm always looking for old works of family members, because I know all the family names in Nunavik, for example, looking for works from different communities and trying to reconnect them with family members on Facebook or something like that. I'm planning to run workshops in Ottawa for Inuit. I want Inuit in urban centers to also have access to traditional skills, such as making gamek or making Inuit clothing. I know there's some things that already happen, but just to add to that whole movement, I guess. And then again, like I said, just always trying to stress that, try to let Inuit have access in all different ways, including just being aware of the possibility that things could be accessed. Like, for example, Canada Council grants. For years, the Canada Council was saying like, oh, they never have Inuit applying, and it's because there's just like a disconnect there as far as communication. Like, Inuit see it as something that's for people down south, and like, but it's actually for all Canadians. I don't know if that's answering. I feel like in the pre-conversation, I was so much more interesting.
I feel that all of these small actions, they accumulate and they build, they build towards things. I think about my late relative, Helen Semyonov, who started this work, she wasn't the only one, but she was an important person sort of at the beginning of this on Kodiak. And, that series of small actions that she undertook, this like commitment to know where our belongings are, to visit them. And this action of visiting was profound in terms of how it affected, subsequent generations of people who are artists. She was an artist, makers, people who are undertaking this work. So I feel like, and I also feel like a very small person within a very large field, and I'm doing, a little bit, but I think those small actions are important, and the effects of them later, we don't always understand how far they'll reach. So I really appreciate you sharing those actions that you're undertaking. And I really think that there's something important about supporting urban Inuit. That's an important action. That's a really significant action as well. So we've actually have shared a little bit about some of the strides in the field. I suppose I can pose this question to you, but we could also open it up to other questions, because I was thinking a little bit as we sort of were ending this part of the conversation about, challenges that we're seeing, as well as, strides that we've seen in the field and where we hope things will move in the future. I feel like both of you have spoken to this in different ways through some of the different projects that you've undertaken over time. I don't know if you wanted to share anything else about that particular question that's coming, front of mind right now. If not, we can also open it up to the audience.
I would say the strides and ways to change Museums are very set in their ways. Oh, we have to do it this way. We have process procedures. Well, yes, but at the same time, those processes and procedures are designed at a time when they assumed us as Indigenous peoples were going to be gone. And the reality is we're still here. We're still thriving, and we are still on our lands. A majority of us are, and we want to get knowledge back. Think about and get creative with what you're doing in your work. I mean, I was looking at the list of panelists, and I mean, there's a lot of wonderful people who are listening that I have a lot of respect for. And I appreciate you participating, but at the same time, think outside the box. I mean, the Ulujuk Museum, when I had the privilege to be there, we were doing things that everybody's like, well, you can't do that. I'm like, why not? Why not give access to the collections? Why not find ways to get creative and bring that knowledge back home so that we can share this lived knowledge that goes back thousands of years? Why not do that? What is the fear? Okay, if something gets broken, well, guess what? These were living pieces. They're meant to be used. They're meant to be repaired, replaced, and rejuvenated. And really start thinking about how do we create a sustainable way to share the knowledge so that our communities can thrive where they are with this knowledge, but also celebrate it instead of hide it and keep it hidden in the box. So that's one of the things that I've learned in the 3 things I did with our communities, going out to sharing that knowledge and then working for 13 years, going into the villages and seeing how powerful that is how do we bring this knowledge to the communities so that they can see it for themselves and they can take it and use it in their way, not our way, in their way, and to create new ways of seeing the world.
Quiana, to both of you so far for what you've shared. You've both been incredibly generous, sharing your thinking, your experience. I'm so grateful for the time that you've already shared today, and so pleased to be in relation. We do have a couple of questions, and I thought that perhaps we could begin to open those up. And I'm not sure, Alyson, if you wanted to ask those questions of the panel.
Actually, I feel like I could add to that last question before we move on. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
I really like what Sven was saying about how these institutions have to think outside the box and really shift as far as how they have relationships with artists and with communities. I think that is so true. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done there on small and big levels. Just in my experience in working with larger institutions, sometimes the little snags that hold up, that make things difficult, are like the most important things that have to be addressed. And it's really to be flexible and to be willing to learn and to be willing to start from a place of humility. As individuals working in those institutions, but the institutions themselves. And I know that is kind of like a tall order for an institution to have some kind of humility, but I think that it's like to approach that as a learning process. I also think, like, as far as challenges, like not just in this field, but in all fields, like capitalism is ailing and throughout the pandemic, it's been shown to not work for the majority of people. And so there's a lot of rethinking that needs to happen. And so I think in order for Inuit artists and communities to move forward, especially if we're talking about the arts field, to move forward in a way that is beneficial for the community as a whole, then we need to also be very wary of falling into this idea that, oh, there's the art stars and they're going to make all this money and that's what we need to aspire to. I don't think that that's people's attitude, but I think that is something that we need to be aware that is an attitude in the arts world, and that we need to move forward in a way that is very particularly Inuk, which is about looking after community.
Kriana, really important to share that, Taqralik. I'm glad that you shared that. I'm going to turn it over to Alyson now to be able to help to field some of these questions, and I'll let you take the lead on that, Alyson.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Tanya. So we got two separate questions here. So I'll just start. This one's directed at you, Sven. So Sven, have you ever had a donation or part of a donation that you've had to return to a community, and how did you negotiate that with your institution?
One of the things I start with, especially here at the Purruq, is when we get a donation, I try to ask the donor first if it can go to the community from where it came. We had a donation that had come in, or somebody brought something in and they were looking at donating it to the Purruq Museum. And I asked them, would it be better if it went to the community from where it was? And they then said, well, yeah, but, and I was like, okay, well, let's have a conversation with the institution. And so working with that donor and the institution, we were able to find a way for them to have it go back to the community from where it came. So even asking about the donations that come in here, I asked the donor if they had talked to communities or if they're interested in doing that. I let them decide so that they're comfortable with what they do. And then from there, I try to help connect them with the communities. So again, it's, yeah, I would love to have it at the Purruq, but at the same time, I think the cultural pieces belong back home. And if the donor is willing to do that, I support them in doing that. So, you know, that's just how I look at it. And like with the Kinsleys, when they made the donation, I asked about the pieces going back to the communities, and they're like, well, the taxes and all these other legal issues of going across the border, you know, really hindered that process. So I tried to get creative. Okay, how do I make sure we give full access to the communities from where they came? And they provided money with that. I mean, it's not the best of all scenarios, but it's what I could do in that process as an Indigenous person of how do we change that practice. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sven. So next one, it wrote, I love how Sven interwove the questions about reversing extractive practices, and I wonder how institutions can better negotiate the troubled histories many of our institutions have, sitting on stolen lands, which have also collected cultural heritage of the peoples they stole from. I would love to hear the panelists' thoughts about this. How do we move beyond acknowledgements and statements and move towards action? So anyone can kind of step in for that question. Taqralik, I see your face. I think it's bursting to say something.
I'm always about the little things, but there's all these little things that people can do. You know, I'm not the good person to answer, I don't think. But like, you know, when you're buying Inuit art, for example, you're not just buying a commodity and as an investment to you know, keep and make money or whatever, like the value is beyond just your own personal belonging. The value, this is cultural heritage, this is part of our culture, and it's really a gift for you. Even if you were paying lots of money for it, it's a gift for you to receive this. And so I feel like there's like a bit of a responsibility there, and I don't know, I can't say exactly what that responsibility is, but like to keep it in mind that it's, you know, it's not just a commodity. So there's that. There's also supporting Inuit artists in any way that you can. There's supporting Indigenous sovereignty in other forms, not just in the art field. Not being racist. Also recognizing that, you know, like when we're talking about land acknowledgement, it's really about, okay, if we just think in the very basic terms of like, okay, this is a capitalist society with property, like, yes, it is their land and they don't have access to it, and they don't have, wherever you are, they don't have the monetary, everything that we have, all the money, everything, all these institutions, everything, they're built up from the land that, in reality belongs to Indigenous people. So like, what does that mean? What kind of thing needs to happen in order for people to have support for, or resources for all these things that have to do with life, including the arts field? Like you see people in the news, like they're giving, actually giving their land back, or they're giving a grant, or they're giving whatever kind of support, whatever kind of way you can support people. You have to think outside the box, like Sven said. And that can be little ways and that can be big ways. But it's really not to just throw our hands up in the air and say, well, I don't know what to do. It's like, try stuff and make mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could all agree with you with that one. Thank you so much. I'll move on to the next question. Maybe Tanya, you can speak to this one. I'll give you a chance to speak. Can you also talk about the language requirements in Canada and how it limits Inuit employment and involvement in institutions?
I'm not sure if I'm the best person to speak to this, but I as I'm from the US and I did not grow up bilingually. My grandparents were trilingual in Ulujuk language and Russian and English. And, that's the story of many of our people at home. But my father understands some Ulujuk language and certainly is not a speaker, not a fluent speaker. And I'm not a fluent speaker, despite all of these efforts at home to revitalize our language. And part of it has to do with the distance I am from my homelands and kind of being in diaspora to my homelands. What I might say is that from my position, we should be supporting Indigenous peoples to learn their languages first and foremost, and then sort of secondarily English or French, depending on sort of the geography or the place that they've grown up in. They should have that choice. And in fact, I think that we should be putting resources behind this. We should be prioritizing it. I know some universities are starting a number of Indigenous language programs. There's also ongoing efforts through the Ulujuk Museum, where I'm from, through cultural camps, through many, many different ways in which communities are working to strengthen language for the continuance of language. But in my view, we should be supporting that and not forcing people to be bilingual in English and French.
Tanya, I agree with you on that. And one of the things I would love to challenge both our governments to is putting money to support these language programs instead of forcing the language programs to apply for funding to create a project that only lasts 3 years and then have to reinvent the wheel again. Why doesn't our government and our communities, the states, support the languages of those regions, and not continue with the language suppression? So again, I think it's raising awareness of how do we change this conversation from, okay, how do we have our languages taught, to here's the money to teach the languages in perpetuity and change it and not wait for it.
And before I forget, there are also a number of immersion programs at the K-12 level across Canada in different communities as well as in the US. So I want to acknowledge those as well, and the work at tribal colleges in both Canada and the US. So those are all important efforts, but we need to continue these efforts and support these efforts.
Absolutely. Taqralik, did you want to add on to that at all?
So the question was about the difficulty caused by the requirement for people to be bilingual. In what context? In any kind of, Looking
The
for community-
limits to Inuit employment and involvement in institutions and the barriers there.
I mean, of course, lots of institutions across Canada require bilingualism. But I come from a very specific community, Nunavik, which is in Quebec, as you know, and of course, Quebec is very pro-French. But historically, the second language for Inuit, because of the way that schools were back in the day, federal day schools and residential schools were in English. Historically, the second language has been English. So it's the predominant second language for Nunavik. And then, of course, French came later. And in Quebec, of course, people are told, you must speak French, you must speak French. For me, I speak French, and it's good for me to speak French because I like to communicate with people, but it's not because I'm like pro-French or pro-English. I see both of those languages as colonial languages. And that's how Inuit see them too. All, other Inuit see them. It's like, why should Inuit have to learn a second colonial language when they were already forced to learn this language, English? Again, the same as what Sven and Tanya are saying, there should be resources put into teaching Inuktitut. But also there's this other thing that happens when you're talking about bilingualism, where sometimes organizations will require that the person speak Inuktitut and English, or Inuktitut and French, which is more rare, but it's like in order to get the job. But like, what if the Inuk doesn't necessarily know enough Inuktitut? Are there going to be resources put into teaching proper Inuktitut to that potential employee? And like this exigency is not put on employees who are not Inuk. You know what I mean? Like, it's a specific situation for an Inuk employee who has to speak Inuktitut, but then the other people who are not Inuk, who work for this Inuit organization, do not have to speak Inuktitut sometimes. So what kind of resources are put into that? I think there's all kinds of resources that need to be put into teaching Indigenous languages, and especially if we're talking about Inuktitut, Inuktitut, the Inuit languages. This is like a personal pet project that I would love to work on, but I don't have time, is to have Inuktitut learning nests, like something like Purruq in Taqralik, which is a really effective Inuktitut teaching series of courses and very immersive Inuktitut learning environment. Like, why is that not available in other places? Why has it been so hard to have people learn Inuktitut from an adult level, maybe from zero, maybe from halfway there, maybe from, all different levels? And I think it really is a question, as Tanya and Sven were mentioning, of there not being resources put towards that. Look at the work that Ulujuk is doing to promote Inuktitut in Nunavut, the territory that is known. Like, if you talk about Inuit in Canada, people think about Nunavut. Why is Inuktitut like third? There's English, French, and then Inuktitut is lower down. Why is that? And I think those are things that have to be addressed. I think I probably went way off in another direction from the question, but it's definitely like something that I think about a lot.
Yeah, 100%. I think, we could all agree that it needs to be way more of a priority. Thank you so much for all of your answers on that. I have another question in here. There's also a kind message that goes with it, so bear with me. Thank you, all of you, for your time and conversation. You have given me much to think about, and I appreciate everything you do. Along the thread of creative ways to make museums and cultural heritage accessible to communities and people, are there any low-key or low-cost ways Inuit can use to access collections? For example, technology or apps that use photogrammetry to 3D scan art on your smartphone. I'm thinking along the lines of, how can Joe Inuk access the collections of his own without having to rely on museum people?
Well, I'll start. I mean, this is something that's like, okay, how do we do this in a way that allows the communities like Joe to be able to get access to these collections, but how do we protect the collections from exploitation? Like with 3D, if somebody gets that on their piece, on their phone, then they can go and print it out. to me, that will then take away from the Inuit artists who are wanting to create cultural pieces and sell them. So how do we protect that? And what is the responsibility of museums in that process? But then also, how do we allow communities to have access to this knowledge where it won't be exploited? So these are ongoing questions that we're still trying to address, especially with how popular 3D has become and how easy you can do it. So these are things that are, I think, a whole nother conversation for not only institutions, but communities to have of how do you protect that cultural knowledge so that the next generation of artists can actually be able to sell work without it being just printed out and, well, I have that and I printed it out, so I don't need to purchase another piece. I want to actually support the Inuit or Indigenous person making that piece. So that's one level of challenges. But again, if you wanted to come and see what we have online, like for example, the Kacey collection, the Inuit collection that we have here now, it's all accessible. We have regular photographs and you can go and look online to see what we have. So finding ways for communities to have access. And then, going back to when I was talking with Avingak yesterday, she came up with a list of 20 Nunavik artists that she was interested in looking at. So if there's people who want to look at collections, being able to contact us and we could send information to them. So being contacted directly as well. And finding ways we can do that, working with the artisans and communities. So these are things that I've been thinking about and trying to find creative ways to share, but also protect for the communities. And I don't want to act as a gatekeeper either. That's the other challenge I have is I'm not the gatekeeper, but at the same time, I don't want to see what has happened in, like, for example, in Southeast Alaska, where you have all this fraudulent art being sold that isn't made by Tlingit people. And how do we not have that happen with our art? How do we protect that? And how do we find ways to protect communities so that we can support our artisans and have that money come to the communities to, again, create that sustainability?
Can I answer that second? I just want to share that I think this is a really important question. I'm interested not so much in 3D printing, but in online database collections that are accessible, that have photographic documentation and information, but also help people to be able to research these, because there's a couple of things that's taken me a long time to know all of the inappropriate and dated terminology if I'm looking for works by Ulujuk people or Shukpiak people around the world. And so that takes a great deal of time to understand how these works have been labeled in the past. Another is, I don't even know all the time where all of our objects are in the world. I did an internship at the Ulujuk Museum when I was really young, and they had done a lot of that research and had identified on a visual map that I remembered where many of these collections are and where I could locate and do more research. But I think even just getting that information onto an online database that people could look at in preparation for a potential visit in the future, because I really do feel that, as Taqralik has said, there is a life force or an energetic quality and a different way of being when we're with these, and that's not something that we can replicate. I think we know that it can't be replicated in a sort of 3D rendering of it, or, so for me, I see it more useful to have this online database as a preparation, research and preparation, and also that the institutions can start to relabel these in appropriate ways. That would really help, or that there's some kind of information for Indigenous peoples so that they know that this grouping of language is how our work is categorized. And some of this work is happening. So the Ulujuk Museum is undertaking a project specifically around this, of these researching online database collections.
And this is something that I did before, starting in 2001, photographing collections from across European museums. So the Ulujuk Museum has those in slide form. So they have an amazing database already. And so hopefully they'll be able to carry that forward.
Thank you so much. Taqralik, would you like to add anything there with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking a lot about things that are in collections, and a lot of those are really precious and irreplaceable. But I also think something about access is really about having the knowledge carried forward. And, you know, like there's some of us that are going to be able to travel to these places, and some of these things are going to be able to eventually be repatriated to different communities, like exactly in the community. And then some things are not. And so how to extend the access that maybe a few people have to larger communities really is, again, about resources, putting resources into cultural activities that keep that knowledge alive that is in those objects. So for example, I know Krista is on this call. Krista Zawadski, amazing curator, did a workshop about Taqralik, which is a very paved beadwork Inuit clothing garment from her region this past summer. And like that is like, I feel like that is like the source of so much richness. Like it is rich beyond any kind of monetary value that something like that would happen. And to see, like, for example, the making of comics of sealskin boots in different communities in Nunavik. I know when I was young, like we didn't have those bearded sealskin boots in every community. But now, of course, there's been workshops over the past, I don't know how many years, thanks in part to Avatak Inuit Cultural Institute. And now you see people making those kind of boots, and like those are so, I don't know, I just can't explain how rich it seems that those objects are. So it's really about disseminating that knowledge in people as well as in digital means.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Oh, one more thing I wanted to say though is like, it's also like, I think it's also very appropriate to have levels of access in collections, so that there's some things that only community members can see or access, you know, oral histories. In Avatak, for example, because I worked there before, some oral histories, genealogy information, some, there's, you know, sacred objects, things like that. Like maybe some of those things are in collections and they are not supposed to be everything, all the information about them available to everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah. On that note, one of the summative practices we did at the Ulujuk Museum and we do here at the Purruq is if a community identifies that and says that should be offline, we take it offline. So, you know, just listening to and practicing what the communities want as well. So making sure that's implemented across all institutions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This question is about language. Language is important as it influences how we see and talk about the world. Can each of you talk about this in relation to your work?
Right now, I'm really trying to find language to bring to the work that I do. And I've been doing that for quite a long time. And I write a range of kinds of writing. And I've worked with Ulujuk language and Cree language due to my relatives and sort of my extended relatives and my immediate familial relatives. And I've integrated that language because even though I'm such an emergent language learner, I have a deep responsibility to do this, you know, for my children, for youth at home. And what's lovely about having a book of poetry is that it travels home. And so much of my work isn't able to get home. And so this is something that people can hold in their hands and that they can have a relationship with and that they can have in their homes, which is a really really powerful thing. And then now I'm also writing my dissertation in relation to some of this work specifically that we've been discussing today. And partly what I'm attempting to do is to bring some language to this collective work, specifically rooted in some key terms at home that have to do with our philosophies of life and the ways in which we are in the world. So I think that's all I'll say about it, because I know we're running out of time, but language is really important, whether that's our relationship to our Indigenous languages, or in my case, because I mostly speak and understand English, also having a facility with that language to communicate some of these key ideas.
I'll just answer really quick. Words matter, and how we use words. For example, one of the things that I want people I'm talking about is, we talk about natives surviving in these regions. We were thriving. And if we change that one word from surviving to thriving, it changes how people look at us, and it changes how we are in part of that conversation. We were thriving in the Arctic. The Arctic is our world, and it's a beautiful place. When outsiders come in, they're like, oh, they're surviving on this and that. And it's like, well, actually, no, we're not. We're thriving. And so thinking about how we're using our words, and then in the exhibit text here, we are putting the name, the original name of every cultural piece that we have access to first. So every visitor will see it written in the culture's language, and how they have it written, so that we are sharing their knowledge first, and then English as a translation second, not vice versa. So how we are sharing it with the public, and then how we're engaging with what is then said about that cultural piece. And then the next would be in English, because most of our visitors are English, but having it be in the community's voices. They're sharing the cultural pieces that we have. I'm not interpreting it for them. So just in that essence of how important language is, and how we're sharing the knowledges from the communities, and empowering the communities to have that voice first, not the institution, not the curator or an outsider.
Absolutely. So that is all the time we have for today. I would like to thank so much to Tanya, Sven, and Taqralik for this amazing conversation. Speaking for everyone that listened, this was a really incredible, dynamic conversation, and I feel very lucky to have been a part of something, and the Smithsonian talks this year were really enriching. I'd also like to thank our advisors, Sonya Kelliher-Combs, Kacey, Purruq, Qunmiġu, Hopson, Krista, Zawadski, and Taqralik Partridge even, for their generous knowledge and guidance on our advisory. Recording of all these events, including this one, will be posted on the website noted in the Q&A on the screen. We hope everyone has an amazing holiday season. Nakumik, Kamaterit, and see you next time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Kuyana.
Kuyana.